Hello, welcome. It's my pleasure today to welcome you to this session on diversity, inclusion, and historic commemoration. I'm Patricia Kell, and I'm the Executive Director of Cultural Heritage at Parks Canada. Je suis Patricia Kell, la directrice exécutive du patrimoine culturel à Parcs Canada. Je tiens à vous souhaiter la bienvenue à cette session sur la diversité, l'inclusion et la commémoration historique. Je vous invite à suivre les présentations en français à travers la traduction simultanée. Before I start, I would like to invite you to start the discussion early. Even as the presentations are taking place, you can put questions or comments into the Q&A box. It's a pleasure to be with you to talk about how we at Parks Canada are working to adapt the National Program of Historical Commemoration in order to better promote diversity and inclusion. Recent public actions to remove statues, deface monuments, and rename features point to Canadians' deep interest in ensuring that Canada's commemorative landscape reflects the whole of our population and aligns with our shared values. Parks Canada's newly approved policy framework for history and commemorations sets as a priority the commemoration of the history of diversity and of Indigenous peoples. It also adopts as principles public engagement and the inclusion of many voices in telling our collective stories. So in this presentation, I'd like to talk about three different things. Well, in fact, over the course of this whole session, to talk about three different things. I'm going to talk a little bit about the framework. My colleague Ashley Campbell is going to talk about some new designations, and my colleague Jared Fichet is going to talk about how we're presenting stories differently at Parks Canada places. Canada's National Historic Sites, Persons and Events reflect a rich and varied heritage and provide an opportunity for Canadians to learn more about our diverse history. Commemoration of places, persons, and events is not just about celebration and achievement. It's also about recognizing and acknowledging the controversial and shameful chapters of our past. Recent world events, including here in Canada, have highlighted the deep-rooted racism that has existed and persists. Whether it's Black Lives Matter, the Idle No More movement, or the public outcry at racist and colonial legacies, there are loud calls that more be done to foster a diverse and inclusive culture and society. Recent events have demonstrated that public expressions of history can be divisive and exclusionary. The current government holds that it is more important than ever for Canadians to unite and build a stronger, more inclusive, and more resilient country. Canada's history has many uneven chapters, but Canada has made the choice to become a more inclusive country. So Parks Canada's response to this has included the development of a new framework for history and commemoration. This framework was approved about a year ago and really sets the path for us, a new path for us, in terms of the way that we create new commemorations and the way we talk about existing commemorations. So the framework contains a number of different pieces, which I'm going to talk about in more detail. So there's a set of principles, there are key practices, strategic priorities, there's a section around historical thinking, and then there's an appendix that talks about the careful review of existing designations. So moving on to think about the principles. There are three principles for the framework: integrity, inclusiveness, and relevance. So in terms of integrity, we acknowledge that Parks Canada is a trusted source of information about history. And therefore we need to be respectful to our partners who choose to share their stories with us. And we need to ensure that our projects are based on carefully planned historical research and that it is open to all perspectives and points of view. So this means that we're seeking to achieve integrity both in terms of the research that we do and also in terms of the relationships that we build. The second of the principles is inclusiveness. So here we acknowledge that different voices, perspectives, and experiences are critical to understanding the past. And in fact, each of those perspectives on a single event in the past may be quite different, and that they are all valid and they all need to be represented in the way that we talk about history. In telling these stories, we need to build strong relationships with groups and invite them to help craft the narrative. And so in the different voices, perspectives, and experience that are presented and the relationships that are cultivated, we seek to achieve inclusiveness. Finally, the third of the principles is relevance. And this is about making connections between the past and the present and why it matters to us today. So history needs to be meaningful to the audience and not something that is just taught, but something that connects with people. So it's around connecting our history to the national and international stories so that we can build an understanding of the world that we live in today, not just about understanding the past, but about understanding why the present is the way that it is. Moving on to the key practices, the framework includes 10 key practices that are aimed at engaging and connecting with audiences in order to capture their imagination and spark their curiosity. So these practices include a desire to address conflict and controversy. So instead of pretending that the past is a seamless series of happy incidents, we are aiming to acknowledge that there has been conflict in the past and that the interpretation of those events and people, and sometimes even places, can be controversial. Another of the practices is that Indigenous people's history needs to be told in their own words and on their own terms. We need to share authority. That means that the Government of Canada, Parks Canada, academic history cannot be the only voice around the meaning of history that is present. It can be one of many, but it needs to share that stage and that authority over what is meaningful history with others. As I've said already, we need to have a full range of voices, perspectives, and experiences present in our practice of history. And finally, we need to acknowledge that interpretations of the past are constantly changing and evolving. So the way that we would have talked about a historical event 20 years ago, let alone 100 years ago, is quite different. And we need to acknowledge that and be willing to work with that in the way that we talk about history now. And also know that the way that we're going to talk about that history 10 years or 20 years or 100 years from now is also going to change again. So the next element of the framework is the strategic priorities. So the framework contains 4 strategic priorities. These are the history of Indigenous people, environmental history, the history of diversity in Canada and the world. In terms of Indigenous history, we're looking at the totality of experiences since time immemorial, so not something that relates to written history in the recent past. And our goal is to acknowledge and present the centrality of Indigenous contributions to Canada's history and to confront the ongoing legacy of colonialism. Our focus on environmental history is really to see humans as a part of nature and not separate from it, and to explore how humans have affected the environment and how the environment has affected us. The history of diversity really looks at how a range of Canadians have affected and influenced our history and the Canada that we know today. This includes looking at the diversity of race, gender, sexuality, language, and religion. This focus on diversity provides opportunities for all Canadians to see themselves, whoever and wherever they are, at our heritage places. And the 4th priority is Canada and the world. And this is really about exploring the relationship between Canada and the rest of the world, looking at events that that shaped Canada and other places, and acknowledging that many Canadians have come from other places. And so the history of the whole world is relevant to the history of Canada. As I said, there's also an appendix in the framework that looks at the careful review of existing designations. And really this was written because the Historic Sites and Monuments Board, which is the body that makes recommendations to the Minister responsible for Parks Canada on the designation of persons, places and events of national historic significance, it's been around for over 100 years. And during that time, that whole time, there have been a sequence of designations, now counting more than 2,000. So as we think about trying to apply the principles and the practices from the framework to this existing body of designations, we recognize that the way that the board and the program have talked about those historical designations in the past no longer fully reflects our objectives now. So there are basically 3 key points to this careful review. The first is that acknowledging that historical interpretation is constantly changing and evolving. And so it is no surprise that the designations that were made in the past and the kinds of things that were said about those designations may no longer resonate in Canada of 2020, and that it is a worthwhile exercise to look at those again and to think about their meaning in a contemporary context. The second is that historical interpretation should emphasize a full range of voices and experiences. So where in the past we may have taken a fairly narrow Eurocentric view on history, those same historical stories may continue to be of great importance today in terms of having shaped Canada, but we need to tell those stories in a more inclusive way and give more people a voice in the telling of those stories. And finally, it acknowledges that history is written from a world view. So earlier designations reflect the time and the context in which they were designated, and they should not be erased, but they should absolutely be considered again in our contemporary context. So the framework has developed some guidelines for reviewing existing designations, including a series of triggers, which include new research that would lead us to reconsider a subject, a public request, public outcry or controversy, a recognition that there's a key historical concept perspective missing from the story, or as a result of an internal review. There is also a public role in this process, in that this needs to be transparent to the public, open to input from the public, and seeking input both from experts and the public. And this includes particularly seeking out particularly relevant perspectives, including perspectives of Indigenous people or other communities. And I just, the photograph on this slide, which is of Cabot, I just thought sort of epitomizes a really sort of square approach to telling the history, and that our objective through the framework and in looking at history going forward is to have a much more dynamic kind of sense of what that history is and what it means to people. I wanted to take a moment to look at a case study. And so this is of the Champlain Monument. This is a monument that's owned by Parks Canada in Orillia, Ontario. And this monument, which dates back to the 1920s, became the subject of some controversy a few years ago and was in need of repair. And so at that, you can sort of see the original construction of the monument on the left with a huge image of Champlain at the top. And the 2 groups of figures on the sides are of Europeans, in one case a missionary, in the other case a fur trader, engaging with the local Indigenous people. But in both cases, in these images, the Indigenous people are in a subservient position. There was also a text plaque that was on the monument. So in the fall of 2018, Parks Canada and the City of Orillia established a joint working group to consider the future of this monument, with a mandate to pursue public engagement and to recommend an appropriate path forward. And so about a year later, a final report was released, which recommended the reinstallation of the main figure, but a replacement for the original plaque and the creation of additional interpretive signage and a reimagining of the side figures in this monument. So this, the final report was endorsed by all the members of the working group, and including being supported by the Huron-Wendat Nation and the Chippewas of Rama First Nation. And so Parks Canada has established a secondary working group to implement the recommendations from this group. So all of that seems completely exemplary in terms of engaging with interested groups and in fact with the public in general in order to rethink the way that this monument exists in 21st century Canada. However, recently, the steps of the monument, and this is the image on the right, were vandalized, were spray painted, and the plinth, which is all that is currently existing of the monument, became a gathering point for anti-racism demonstrations. So my point in telling this story is that, I mean, here's a case where we tried very hard to implement the approach that's espoused in the framework, and still there's a touch point here for demonstration and for public debate. And as a result of that, Parks Canada has gone back to its partners again and has made a decision to slow down the process of implementing the recommendations. But I tell this story to acknowledge the difficulty that taking this approach to history can have and the challenges of making this live. So going forward, Parks Canada has 3 points at which to influence how Canadians understand our history. So the first is by ensuring that the persons, places, and events who are designated of national historic significance reflect an inclusive and diverse view of Canadian history. The second is that the commemorations, so the way that we talk publicly about these persons, places, and events, fully reflect the diverse perspectives about them, including perspectives that cast them as shameful. And the third is that the stories can be shared at Parks Canada places, and they should include stories of diversity and include diverse perspectives on the stories. And in the following presentations, Ashley and Jared will examine some of this work. So finally, I'd like to introduce my colleagues who are going to take over the discussion from here. So Ashley Campbell is the Director of Heritage Designations and Programs at Parks Canada. She has a Bachelor of Arts degree from McGill University in Latin American and Caribbean Studies, and a master's degree in International Affairs from Carleton University. She joined the public service in 2004 and moved to Parks Canada in 2016 as the Manager of International and Intergovernmental Affairs before taking on her current role in 2019. Ashley's passionate about protecting and presenting cultural and natural heritage in Canada and around the world. I'd also like to introduce Jared Pichet. Jared is the Director of Archaeology and History, and in that role, he's responsible for managing a dedicated team of archaeologists, technicians, and historians who are passionate about protecting and presenting Canada's national treasures. Mr. Pichet joined the Parks Canada team in 1999 as a University of Ottawa cooperative student, helping build the web feature This Week in History. With a passion for history, cultural heritage, and national historic sites, Jared has held a variety of positions and provided leadership with respect to policy and program development. Prior to becoming director, Jared was Field Unit Superintendent for Southwestern Ontario and was responsible for managing 13 national historic sites and 1 national park from Niagara-on-the-Lake to Windsor. So I'd like to thank them both for joining us today. And now I'll pass the microphone over to Ashley.
Thank you very much, Patricia, for that introduction. So as Patricia mentioned, I'm the Director for Heritage Designations and Programs at Parks Canada. And with this presentation, I'm looking forward to just covering a little bit more background related to our program, some of the challenges and opportunities that we're facing in our work and how that links to the issues of inclusion and diversity in Canada, and some of the new directions and approaches, including new nominations, new designations that we recently announced that speak to the importance of recognizing Canada's diversity through our work. So just repeating a bit what Patricia said, our program, the Program of National Historical Commemoration, is a public nomination program. And as you can see from this, the picture at the lower part of the slide, the Historic Sites and Monuments Board, which advises the government on historical designations, has been in existence since 1919. And so with over 100 years of history, and now over 2,000 designations of sites, persons, and events of national historic significance, there's clearly been a lot of evolution over that time in terms of the topics, the subjects that are recognized for historical designation. In terms of Parks Canada's role supporting this work, so as I mentioned, the Historic Sites and Monuments Board is the body that actually provides recommendations to the Minister of Parks Canada on designations, where Parks Canada's role is to provide historical research. We provide secretariat services to the board. We also organize commemorative ceremonies, particularly related to plaque unveilings for designations. We also install and care for the plaques, and we manage within our network of protected areas and national historic sites, 171 of Canada's national historic sites. And one of our real objectives and goals in doing this work is to share Canada's history with all Canadians. So as Patricia mentioned, our real orientation currently is to implement the new framework for history and commemoration, which was approved last year. This really does set out our principles, our practices, how we're going to do our work, our priorities, and our vision going forward. And it's an extremely important document for us to be able to shift the program in a direction of being more inclusive and accepting of Canada's history and some of the more challenging periods in our past. So just to repeat somewhat again what Patricia was highlighting in her presentation as well, we are at a point where we're facing a number of challenges, but that also give rise to opportunities for us in our program. The image there is of the plaque by Sir John A. Macdonald's gravesite, and we recognize that important figures of Canada's past, their legacy and the interpretation of the role that they played evolves over time. So a key piece of work for us currently is reviewing and updating statements of significance and plaque text to better reflect current interpretations and realities associated with important figures of the past and important events and places too, as Patricia mentioned. We're also promoting new forms of commemoration and public involvement in our program. The bronze plaque is one way of engaging and capturing people's attention, but clearly with new digital platforms and social media, there's plenty of other ways that we can try to connect with Canadians about their past. And as Patricia already mentioned, we recognize that of the 2,000 plus designations that we have in our program, they're not all representative of the diversity of Canada and what's made Canada what we are today. And in particular, there's gaps when it comes to recognizing the contributions, history, and cultures of Indigenous peoples, and that special relationship that Indigenous peoples have with traditional lands and waters. So essentially, we have this opportunity through implementing the new framework to move ourselves in a direction that's going to put the program in better position to contribute towards inclusion and diversity within the cultural heritage landscape in Canada. So I'm going to speak now of some recent designations that we've announced through our program. The first set of designations I wanted to talk about relate to subjects important for Black history in Canada. So this was an announcement that was made through social media, given the context with COVID-19. The image on the left is a social media release of a video by Parliamentary Secretary Greg Fergus, who announced the Government of Canada's recognition of 4 new designations focusing on Black history stories. So this included a designation of the enslavement of African peoples in Canada. This was an event designation. We also had a designation for the West Indian Domestic Scheme in Canada, which was the immigration program in the 1950s. And then we had 2 National Historic Persons designated. Larry Gaines, who was a heavyweight boxer champion who left Canada to fight in Great Britain and had to struggle to overcome barriers to participating in professional sports, as well as Richard Pierpoint, who was a Black loyalist in Canada. So these are stories that are perhaps less known, but that are important in terms of being able to reflect the diversity of different experiences in Canada for Black Canadians. And the interesting part of this designation and this set of designations, I think, too, is there was a strong social media reaction, quite negative in some cases, to the Parks Canada announcement of these new designations. In some cases, people not recognizing that that Canada has a history of slavery, and expressing frustration that there wasn't a similar emphasis on Canada's history in terms of abolition of slavery and support for the Underground Railroad. And this I think speaks to what's known in Canada and what's commonly talked about, and the fact that I think there is a designation under the National Historic Program, the National Program of Historical Commemoration, dating back to the 1920s, related to the Underground Railroad. And yet this idea that Canada and the colonies that then became Canada had a history of enslavement as well, that's less well known, and it's something that some Canadians don't recognize and don't see in this. So the opportunity that we have through our program is to really spread awareness and to shed light, as Patricia had indicated, on more shameful and difficult periods of our past, to make sure that even these aspects are well known. But it certainly means that when people think about commemoration, it's not the same as thinking about a celebration. We're really talking about some very difficult periods of our history in some of our designations. The other set of designations I wanted to talk about relate to a partnership that we have with the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. So as part of the Government of Canada's response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, and particularly Call to Action 79, Parks Canada has been working with the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation to commemorate the legacy and history of residential schools in Canada. So Parks Canada has been very much in a collaborative process working with the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation to prepare a nomination that would speak to the experience of Indigenous peoples and the residential school system. And this led to the designation of the residential school system as a national historic event through a virtual announcement on September 1st that was hosted by the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation and included participation from a number of interested parties, including the National Indigenous organizations, survivor representatives, Parks Canada, our minister, and a number of others as well. At the same time, there was also the announcement of 2 former residential schools that have now been designated as National Historic Sites. So this includes the former Shubenacadie Indian Residential School and the former Portage La Prairie Indian Residential School. And these are designations that are the result of those communities and those survivor groups being at a place where they wanted to have these commemorations move forward, driven really by the desire to share the stories, make sure the history is not forgotten. We do expect that there will be other additional nominations related to residential schools, and we're continuing to do outreach with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, as well as direct engagement with interested communities, recognizing also that for some communities, pursuing a National Historic Site designation is not necessarily their objective, but that they may still be interested in participating in commemoration of the event designation and looking at different ways that we can support commemoration that are respectful of the interests of different Indigenous communities. So for example, rather than strictly limiting forms of commemoration to a bronze plaque, which is our normal process, looking at alternative forms of commemoration that speak to some of the ways of remembering that Indigenous communities want to pursue. And this is with the support of funding that we received in budget 2018 to be able to move this work forward. So I'm just going to share a video that was produced by the Mi'kma'ki Daybird Cultural Center. And with thanks here to Tim Bernard, who's the executive director of the Mi'kma'ki Daybird Cultural Center, and he's also the co-chair of the Tripartite Culture and Heritage Working Committee, who gave us permission to use the video. And I think what's powerful about the video is it speaks to the importance of this former school site and the importance of the designation process. Even though the building of the former school is no longer standing, the space itself is a place of remembrance for people. And it's a testament to the impact and experience of survivors, their families, and communities.
I'm a survivor of the Shubenacadie Residential School. I was 4.5. I came to join my sister and my brother. My family was one of the last children to leave the school in 1967 when it closed. It's been 53 years. Yeah. In the 80s, there was a fire. It burned like it was made of wood. The flames were hundreds of feet up above. People were from all over to watch the school burn. We are in Shubenacadie on the former site of the Shubenacadie Indian Residential School, beside the plastic factory that's here right now. I come here often to do ceremony for our ancestors, to leave food offerings for our spirits that are here, and to pray for the families that are still here, that are still struggling, and those that are still on their healing journey. The site should have been maintained as a sacred site. When you come here, you can feel the spirits here. You can feel the energy. Now, the site is recognized as a place, a historic place. It opens up the conversation to talk about truth and reconciliation. We've been working on this with the Tripartite Culture and Heritage Committee, Mi'kma'ki Daybird, Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq, with the federal government and the provincial government and our Mi'kmaq government. I have to thank them for helping to speed up the process. But also I have to thank the survivors. Their tenacity and their courage and their patience. They're seniors, you know, they're elders. And we have lost so many. This place impacted so many lives. And I pray that this place will help us to acknowledge our past, but also to help us to heal for the future. And making sure our descendants and all Canadians will have a place to come to honor the survivors so that no one will ever forget about the legacy of the residential school in Shubenacadie.
So thank you again to Tim Bernard for allowing us to share this video. It really does make you think about the impact of efforts to commemorate and the meaning that it can have in terms of allowing communities to find a way to move beyond the. Can I start again? I'm just going to start this again.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought entirely. So thanks again to Tim Bernard, the Executive Director of the Mi'kmaq Daybreak Cultural Center, for allowing us to share this video. So I'd like to close with acknowledging that we know we have a lot of work to do within our program to make make sure that the designations within our system reflect Canada's diversity. Certainly, we know too that the representativity within the program is not the only element that we need to consider. There's also the aspect of representation on the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada, as well as diversity within the ranks of those of us who work in the Secretariat supporting the board, and more broadly within Parks Canada and the public service. Certainly the budget 2018 funding that we received has allowed us to move forward some important initiatives, particularly with respect to residential school commemoration, as well as sharing Indigenous voices and perspectives. And my colleague Jared will be speaking more about some of that other work in order to bring those stories and voices to light through the work of a program that his team is leading. And if you just look at some of the images of plaque unveiling ceremonies that we've supported through our program, you can see at the community level how meaningful and how important it is to have the opportunity to have these important aspects of Canada's history shared and known, and be made part of the record of Canada's history. So with that, I will turn it over to Jared and for more discussion on the Stories of Canada work.
Thank you very much, Ashley, and thank you, Patricia, for the introduction. I just want to say I'm very happy to be here to speak about this exciting program. Je suis très fier d'être ici avec vous pour présenter un programme que Parcs Canada, depuis plusieurs années, est en train de mettre en place. So the program that I'll be speaking to you about today is something that we refer to internally as the Stories of Canada, or Récits du Canada. And it's a program that really is designed, as both Patricia and Ashley have indicated, to operationalize the new framework for history and commemoration. So it's about really looking at how we can transform how we present history at our sites. As Ashley mentioned, we were fortunate back in 2018 to receive some budget funding to implement Call to Action 79. And specifically, one of the elements of Call to Action 79 that this program is based on is to ensure that Indigenous contributions to Canada's history are fully acknowledged and present, particularly at the places managed by Parks Canada. So as Patricia mentioned, the framework is really the foundational piece for us to start really expanding how we've been presenting history at all of our places, not just National Historic Sites, but our national parks and marine conservation areas as well. And what this program is really designed to do right now, as I said, is to ensure that the Indigenous perspective, voices, and experiences are reflected at the places managed by Parks Canada. So approximately 40 sites from across our system were selected and received funding to work with Indigenous partners and communities to rethink the importance of these places, to really challenge the current narrative and together update how we see these places, and in doing so reflect different perspectives on the importance of these places. The foundation of this program really is co-development, and what I would say is that we're still in the early stages of this program, because when we speak of co-development, it really is throwing out our own sort of perceptions and sitting down at a table and asking our partners, how do we want to do this together? And that conversation can take us in a number of amazing places, and it has thus far. But it also presents unique challenges to our Indigenous partners, because they're also dealing with a number of other issues within their communities that are important. So the foundation of this program is really providing our partners with capacity assistance to be able to work with us and update the historical narrative. So what I'm going to do with this presentation is just show some of the examples. So the projects that were selected, as I mentioned, touches close to 40 sites, are tremendously different in scope and objective. We have small projects like renaming a day use area to use an Indigenous name as opposed to what it's typically been known as. But then we have very ambitious projects, and I'll show you a few of those, where we're really looking to completely renew the stories as well as the relationships at several sites. So I'll start in the Yukon, because I think this is one of the more ambitious projects that we have. Back in February of 2019, the Yukon basically invited all of their Indigenous partners, and there are many up there, to a meeting, like a first sort of conversation about what the Stories of Canada program could potentially be from their perspective. Given that all of our sites are located in traditional lands and waters, it was really important to start the conversation on a positive foot. And really what this meeting did is it set sort of the foundation for the engagement to move forward, which is one of, as I mentioned, co-development, collaboration, and the spirit of the meeting was to really start by asking some of the tough questions, acknowledge the absence of many of the stories in our places, and to build sort of a path forward to look at it. So what you see here is one of the projects, and as I said, they range so greatly in terms of what we're doing. So what you see here on this slide is it's a carving project for the SS Klondike National Historic Site. And really this is meant to be a welcoming reflection of the Indigenous presence at that National Historic Site. In addition, there are, at the Tay Chal Dal Visitor Center, we co-developed new interpretive panels that really speak about the Indigenous connection to the land. It really looks at ensuring that their language and culture of the Kluane First Nations are present and explain their unique connection to the land. And as I mentioned, that carving project, it's not quite finished yet, but what it is doing, and I'll speak to another project as well, is it's actually helping Indigenous youth reconnect with some of their ways of doing things that maybe have been lost in the community. So that was, again, one of the objectives of the program, is to make sure that, again, build capacity within the communities to be able to tell their stories the way they want, as Patricia mentioned, and on their own terms. This particular project is a traveling exhibit, so Revealing Chignecto is a project that's been in the work for over 2 years, and it's a partnership with the Confederation of Mainland Mi'kmaq. And really what it's setting out to do is completely redefine the history of that area. So the Indigenous perspective, the Acadian perspective, and the partnership with the Confederation of Mainland Mi'kmaq has been very rewarding on numerous levels. It's challenged us to think differently, which is, again, one of the objectives of this program, to allow for multiple voices and experiences to be present. And we're looking forward to this one being complete, hopefully in the next little bit. It is one where I would say it's been a very fantastic relationship, but it also underscores that we still have some challenges ahead of us in terms of implementing the framework and letting our own biases go sometimes. So hopefully more on that in the next little bit. These are just some of the images, again, for this traveling exhibit, which is, as I mentioned, it's been 2 years in the making, and we look forward to seeing it completed with our partners. This particular project is up in the Pingo Canadian Landmark area, for those of you familiar with it, and Tuktoyaktuk is the community in which this particular Stories of Canada project actually saw something developed to be put within the community, not necessarily just at a Parks Canada place. So the program supported this carving, and it was 2 master carvers and 2 apprentice carvers who worked on this. And really, the goal is to have the community reflect on their ancestors, as well as past leaders in the community. And the inter-panels that will support this moving forward really are to tell the stories of the past and for people to see themselves reflected in the history of that place, of that community. This particular project, as I mentioned, we're not just looking at national parks, but this is actually a project for the Lake Superior National Marine Conservation Area. And really, we're working with the Pays Plat First Nations, again, to share their stories, their teaching, and their language through new interpretive panels and carvings as well throughout the region. And really, this particular project it represents and is meant to reflect the 7 grandfather teachings up in that area. And again, for those of you not familiar with a marine conservation area, it literally is water. So this is a community-driven event as well. So these will be throughout the community to sort of draw awareness to the Indigenous contribution to this particular marine conservation area, but also the history of the area. And I'll end with this one because I think it's a really sort of, it underscores for me the reason why this program has so much potential and promise. This is a picture of our colleagues at Fort Langley National Historic Site. The conversations that they had in terms of establishing what could be done at Fort Langley were so positive that, unbeknownst to us, a blanket ceremony was planned for the staff at Fort Langley, as well as some of the Stories of Canada team who were out there for the meeting. And I bring this up because, again, co-development and building those relationships, the integrity in those relationships, as Patricia mentioned in the framework, are absolutely critical for the success of this program moving forward. If we can build that strong foundation of collaboration and again, we don't come to the table with any kind of preconceived idea of what we would like to see, that we actually let the conversation flow, listen to our Indigenous partners, try to make sure that the voice that we want at our places is really reflective of their stories on their terms, as Patricia mentioned, is critical. So I end with this one because the foundation of this program really is the relationships that we're building with our Indigenous partners. And this particular conversation has led to both a book and theater project that's going to move forward, and it's a partnership with the Coast Salish Arts and Cultural Society as well as the Kwantlen Cultural Center. And so again, it's one of those projects that has a lot of potential, and we look forward to seeing it come to fruition. So those are just some of the examples that this program is looking at doing. Again, the scope is very wide-ranging. We have other projects that really do look at more traditional forms of interpretation, but as I mentioned with some of the carvings, you know, the idea here is that not to be prescriptive in any way, and let the conversation go where the conversation goes. So I thank you very much for the time to present just some of the examples, and you know, as the years progress with this program, I'm sure we'll be back to share some more of the success stories. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Now it's my turn to say thank you. A big thank you to both Ashley and Jared for their presentations and for demonstrating how the direction and the framework is allowing us to actually make a change through projects in the ground and through our program of historical designation. So a big thank you to you both. And now we look forward to everyone's questions.